He laughed at her pain during their divorce in court, even she didn't expect what came next. The courtroom buzzed with tension as the final day of their divorce trial began. Murmurs echoed off the walls, a mixture of curiosity and judgment, as eyes shifted from the sharply dressed man leaning smugly in his chair to the woman sitting across from him, visibly trying to remain composed. When the judge asked a simple question about their shared finances, he chuckled, crossing his arms and letting out a louder laugh than necessary, echoing through the silent room. "She never even knew how much we had," he said, shrugging with false innocence. The laughter wasn't just disrespectful, it was calculated. He turned to her and added, "Good luck managing anything without me." A low gasp spread across the courtroom. The woman blinked rapidly but didn't look away. Her hands trembled slightly in her lap, and the air around her felt thick with humiliation. Her lawyer remained frozen, too stunned by the moment to offer objection. The judge frowned, but before anything could be said, the man added, "She thought being a good wife meant lighting candles and cooking dinner, not understanding contracts or investments." The audience whispered among themselves, eyes widening, some shaking their heads, others stifling amusement. She sat there, not speaking, not moving, but in that stillness, something began to shift deep within her, something even she didn't recognize yet. Years before that moment, their lives had looked very different. They met when she was 24, working part-time at a local bookstore while finishing her master's in education. He had just launched his second real estate startup, wearing confidence like cologne. He approached her at a reading event, asking questions about the book instead of making small talk. She was drawn to his directness, his charm. He listened when she spoke, smiled as if everything she said fascinated him. Within 6 months, they were living together. In just under a year, they married. Their wedding was small but elegant, held in a garden lined with lavender and white roses, with promises whispered under the golden hue of a fading summer sun. Back then, he made her feel like she was chosen. He often praised her intellect, telling friends how she kept him grounded. They traveled often, investing in properties while she focused on launching her career as a curriculum developer. She admired how he could walk into any room and command attention, and he said he admired her patience, her discipline. But with time, the admiration turned into something else. The compliments became backhanded. The jokes, sharper. The attention, less frequent. She told herself it was just stress, he was growing a business, after all. But when his laughter started carrying contempt, and when his eyes began wandering during conversations, she could no longer pretend it was the same man she married. It started subtly, little remarks that left her doubting herself. He'd say things like, "You wouldn't understand, it's a financial matter," or "You should stick to what you're good at, baking and reading bedtime stories." At first, she laughed it off. Maybe he was joking. Maybe he didn't mean it the way it sounded. But the comments persisted, evolving from condescension to open dismissal. He began making decisions without consulting her, about their home, about money, even about shared vacations. He said he was protecting her from stress. She started to shrink inside the marriage, quietly folding parts of herself away to avoid conflict. She stopped mentioning her career goals. He never asked. She didn't tell him about the course she wanted to take or the nonprofit she dreamed of joining. Whenever she brought something up, he'd sigh or change the subject. One night at dinner, she mentioned a grant proposal she was excited about. He looked at her, laughed, and said, "That sounds cute, honey, but you really think you'll get it?" Something in her broke. It wasn't the words alone, it was the tone, the way he didn't even look up from his phone. She cleared the dishes in silence that night, her heart heavier than the plates she carried. He used to say she inspired him. Now, he acted as if she was a burden. He played the charming husband in public. At parties and dinners, he placed his hand gently on her back, introduced her with flowery praise, even poured her wine. Friends admired how in love they looked. But behind closed doors, his attention evaporated. He dismissed her opinions with a wave, rolled his eyes when she disagreed, and sometimes left the room mid-conversation. If she challenged him, even gently, he would sulk for days or accuse her of being ungrateful. "I give you this life," he once hissed during an argument. "You wouldn't have anything if it weren't for me." The worst moments came when others were present, especially friends or colleagues. He'd make little jokes at her expense, sometimes about her salary, other times about her idealistic views. "She still believes in changing the world through textbooks," he once said at a dinner party, eliciting awkward laughter. She smiled weakly, sipping her wine, feeling the sting of humiliation in her throat. No one defended her. Over time, she stopped attending those events. She found solace in solitude, in long walks, and in teaching, a profession where she still felt heard, respected. But the marriage she'd once been proud of had become a slow, quiet erosion of her identity. In the courtroom, the damage was more than emotional, it was deliberate. He had hired one of the most aggressive attorneys in the state. His team painted her as lazy, naive, incapable of handling responsibility. They framed her as someone who lived off his earnings and contributed nothing. She listened as falsehoods twisted into narratives. She had no real income, her master's degree was never used meaningfully, she refused to be involved in finances. Each sentence hit like a stone. The courtroom, filled with strangers, now held fragments of her life, contorted and displayed like evidence of failure. And then, he laughed. Not just once. He laughed again when her lawyer fumbled with a document. He laughed when she mentioned how she had homeschooled their daughter during the pandemic. He shook his head and said aloud, "All that did was make our kid awkward." The judge narrowed her eyes but didn't intervene. Her cheeks burned, her throat tightened, and her eyes filled, but she refused to let the tears fall. At that moment, she realized something important. He wasn't just trying to win. He wanted to erase her. To break her in front of others. But she would not give him that satisfaction. Not now. Not ever again. She left the courtroom that afternoon with her head down, not because she accepted defeat, but because her strength was focused on holding everything together. No one stood by her. Her parents had passed years ago, and the few friends she once had drifted away during the years she spent absorbed in a marriage that slowly consumed her. She walked alone to the parking lot, the sound of her heels against the pavement echoing like the rhythm of solitude. Her lawyer tried to console her, but the words felt hollow. She wasn't grieving a marriage anymore, she was grieving the person she'd been forced to abandon inside it. At home, she sat at the kitchen table, staring at the same polished surface where she used to grade papers and pack lunches. Everything looked the same, yet nothing felt familiar. She touched the edge of the chair where her daughter once sat, practicing spelling words. That life felt distant, like someone else's memory. Now, even her own child barely spoke to her. At 13, her daughter had grown cold, drawn closer to the father who offered gifts and smiles, but never presents. She couldn't blame the girl, she too had once fallen for the same performance. Bills began to pile up. The joint accounts had been frozen, and the credit cards she once used were now closed. When she called the bank, she was told her name had been removed as an authorized user. She had a modest teacher's pension, but with legal fees and rent for a new apartment, it quickly drained. He had kept the house, of course, insisting it was purchased solely with his earnings, conveniently ignoring the years she sacrificed her career to raise their daughter. The narrative painted in court wasn't just cruel, it was strategic. Every step had been planned to make her seem dependent, helpless, and undeserving. She sat late into the night, highlighting lines in legal documents she barely understood. Her attorney did what he could, but the opposing team was relentless. They dug through years of receipts, twisted email exchanges, and even brought up her canceled therapy sessions as evidence of instability. It wasn't just a legal battle, it was personal warfare. And while he smiled and shook hands with courtroom staff, she was left to sell her wedding ring just to pay for the next round of hearings. The humiliation wasn't just public, it was financial, psychological, and deeply calculated. Her daughter stopped coming to the weekend visits. At first, it was small things, a forgotten bag, a rescheduled piano lesson. But eventually, the excuses grew into silence. Texts went unanswered. When she called, the child's voice was flat, distant, rehearsed. "I'm busy," she'd say. "Maybe next time." And next time never came. It was more painful than any of the court proceedings, being slowly erased from the life she helped nurture. Her daughter had always been gentle, curious, and thoughtful. Now she was guarded, skeptical, and colder than the courtroom air. One afternoon, she drove past the school during dismissal. From inside her car, she saw her daughter step into the sleek black SUV that once was a family car. Her ex stood beside it, placing a designer jacket over the girl's shoulders. They laughed. It looked effortless, almost perfect. She didn't honk, didn't wave. She just watched, feeling like a stranger to her own child. She drove home with the windows rolled up, the sound of her breath the only thing breaking the silence. She didn't cry. The tears had dried up days ago, replaced by something heavier, numbness. The third day of trial brought an unexpected moment. During recess, she saw a familiar face across the courthouse hallway. A woman in a navy suit, clutching a leather portfolio, paused when their eyes met. Recognition flickered. It was her former colleague from her teaching days, someone she had once shared lunch breaks and long conversations with. Back then, they dreamed of opening a learning center together. That dream, like many others, was shelved for the marriage. The woman approached slowly. "I didn't know it was you," she said softly. "I'm part of his legal support team." "I'm sorry." They spoke briefly. The friend looked conflicted. She admitted she hadn't realized the full scope of what was happening. "It's not what I thought," she whispered. "If you need someone to talk to, reach out." Then she was gone, called back into the courtroom. But her words lingered. It was the first flicker of human compassion she'd felt in weeks. That night, she pulled out an old planner from the closet and flipped to a page where they had scribbled ideas years ago: community, growth, resilience. She read those words again and again, as if they had been left for her by a version of herself who knew this moment would come. The next morning in court, her ex's confidence was even more unbearable. When the judge asked for clarification about a real estate holding, he chuckled and leaned forward. "Your Honor, she didn't even know we owned it," he said, waving his hand dismissively. Then, glancing toward his attorney, he laughed aloud. The kind of laugh meant to embarrass, not amuse. Even the judge raised an eyebrow. The courtroom audience murmured again, some with amusement, others with quiet discomfort. She sat perfectly still, back straight, but her eyes were locked onto his. She didn't flinch. He continued, mocking her education, her contributions, even her cooking. She's good with cookies, he smirked. Maybe she can sell those at a farmer's market. This time, a few people actually laughed. She scanned the room, noting who smiled, who looked away. But what none of them knew was that the woman sitting quietly before them wasn't broken. Something inside her had settled, not with defeat, but with determination. This wasn't the end. She had stopped hoping for kindness. Now, she was preparing for truth. As she waited outside the courtroom during a brief recess, a soft voice behind her made her turn. It was the same former colleague she had run into earlier, the one now working on his legal team. She looked nervous, glancing side to side before leaning closer. "He's hiding things," she whispered. "He's not showing everything to the court." Her voice was urgent but low. "I shouldn't be saying this, but you need to look into his old business files. The ones from 5 years ago. Start there." Before she could reply, the woman turned and walked away, her heels clicking sharply as if punctuating her risk. That night, she sat on the floor of her small apartment, surrounded by boxes of old documents she had begged her attorney to request in discovery. Most of it had been dismissed as irrelevant by the opposing counsel, but the whisper reignited a fire she thought she had lost. She combed through tax returns, account summaries, and emails. At first, it felt overwhelming. But then, in a folder misnamed archive_contract_backups, she saw the first red flag, an ownership agreement from a property she was told had been sold off years ago. Except it wasn't. It had been quietly transferred to a shell company with a name she didn't recognize. Yet the signature? It was his. The more she searched, the more she found. Old email threads showed her ex instructing an assistant to redirect business funds through personal channels. Another message referred to their daughter's trust, one she never even knew existed. "She doesn't need to know," he had typed. "The less she's involved, the easier this goes through." Her hands trembled as she scrolled. He had spun an entire financial web, funneling profits into hidden accounts and using her name as a cover on debts she never consented to. She wasn't just left out, she was being used as a shield. She took photos of every file, uploaded them to a secured drive, and created multiple copies. For the first time in weeks, her breath felt steady. The powerlessness that had clouded her began to thin. This wasn't about revenge, it was about truth. She realized the extent of what had been done to her, not just emotionally, but financially and legally. She had been erased from the life she helped build, yet used to prop up its foundations. Now, she had evidence. She called her lawyer first thing the next morning. His voice, once cautious, grew firm. "This changes everything," he said. "We need to act fast." With the new evidence submitted, the judge granted a brief continuance to examine the documents. Meanwhile, her attorney hired a forensic accountant to analyze the transfers. What came back was staggering. There were not one, but 3 accounts registered offshore. And one of them had been set up in their daughter's name, without her knowledge or consent. Over $200,000 had been funneled through it, masked as educational savings. Yet not a cent had been used for school. It was a financial mirage, crafted to keep her out and the court blind. When she looked at the paperwork, she remembered every school fundraiser she had attended, every art supply she bought out of pocket, every meal she packed with care while wondering how they'd afford next month's bills. And all that time, he had resources stashed away, untouched. She felt anger, yes, but more than that, a deep, aching betrayal. He hadn't just lied. He had let her worry, let her suffer, knowing he had the means to help, and chose not to. Her tears weren't weakness. They were a release. But this time, she didn't cry alone. She cried with purpose. As her team dug deeper, another revelation surfaced, one that shook the very core of the property dispute. The house he claimed as his sole asset, the one she had been forced to leave behind, wasn't even legally his. A search of the deed history revealed that the property had been inherited years earlier from a distant uncle and, due to a clerical error never corrected, remained in both their names. It was a shared asset, no matter what he claimed in court. Yet he had refinanced it twice, forged her signature once, and collected rental income when she was forced to move out. Her attorney prepared a motion. It was no longer just about a contested divorce, it was about fraud. The courtroom, once a space of intimidation, began to shift in tone. The judge reviewed the paperwork with measured silence. And for the first time, her ex didn't smile. When the judge asked if he had anything to say, he looked uncertain, glancing at his legal team. "We'll need time to verify the documents," his lawyer said, but the judge's eyes narrowed. "You have 5 days," she replied coldly. "And if this is true, this entire case will be reopened under very different terms." Though the tide had begun to turn, the process was far from over. She knew she would need more than documents, she needed protection. The moment her ex realized she had found the truth, his demeanor changed. No more laughter, no more mockery. Instead, silence. The kind that made her uneasy. She called her former colleague, the one who first whispered the warning. "I know I'm asking a lot," she said. "But I need help. Real help." The woman hesitated, then said, "I'll introduce you to someone. She's discreet. And very good." That same evening, she met with a woman who specialized in high-conflict family litigation. They spoke in a quiet cafe, away from courthouses and offices. The woman listened, took notes, asked precise questions. "He underestimated you," she said finally. "They always do. But this time, he won't see it coming." It was the first time anyone had spoken to her not with pity, but with respect. That night, she walked home with her steps lighter, her shoulders lifted. She wasn't alone anymore. For the first time since this all began, she wasn't reacting, she was preparing. The next court session felt different from the moment she walked in. Her ex no longer looked smug, instead, he kept checking his phone, whispering to his attorney. Her own legal team arrived with a thicker binder, more organized, more assertive. The new advisor she brought in had rewritten their entire approach. Now, they weren't just defending, they were confronting. With documents in hand and timelines laid out, her lawyer spoke clearly, there is significant evidence of intentional concealment of marital assets. The judge nodded slowly, turning pages with visible focus. The weight of the room shifted, and with it, the air itself. She didn't speak during that hearing, but her silence spoke volumes. Every time her name was mentioned, it wasn't in pity, it was in strength. Her ex tried to interject several times, but the judge silenced him. "We will address all concerns in due order," she said sternly. The woman watched as, for the first time, he struggled to maintain control. His voice cracked once. His face, usually so composed, twitched when confronted with the account in their daughter's name. The judge's expression hardened. "You placed a financial instrument in a minor's name without joint consent?" The man said nothing. The power he once held in that courtroom was now beginning to crumble. That weekend, a quiet knock on her apartment door startled her. She opened it to see her daughter, eyes swollen and red, holding a small backpack. "Can I stay here tonight?" the girl asked softly. No words could fully capture that moment. She opened the door wider, and they embraced for the first time in weeks. Later that night, while her daughter showered, she noticed a small notebook sticking out from the backpack's side pocket. It was a journal. She hadn't meant to pry, but something made her pause when she saw her own name written on the corner of a page. The handwriting was messy but emotional. She sat on the edge of the bed, reading entries filled with confusion, hurt, and longing. Her daughter had been manipulated, told that her mother didn't care, that she had abandoned the family by filing for divorce. "But I don't believe it anymore," one entry read. "I remember her staying up late to help me with school. I remember how she made pancakes on Saturdays." The pages became a mirror of the pain the child had endured, but also of the light that was still alive in her memory. She closed the journal gently, pressing it to her chest. Her fight wasn't just for herself, it was for this girl, this truth, and this restoration. On the day the court reconvened, the courtroom buzzed again, but now it was different. The woman entered with her team, her daughter quietly seated in the gallery beside one of her teachers, who had offered support. Her lawyer stood with poise, opening with a statement that silenced even the spectators. They submitted digital evidence, traced transfers, and introduced a witness, the forensic accountant, who clearly and calmly explained the financial schemes. It was all laid bare: the trusts, the transfers, the hidden assets, the manipulation of documentation. Her ex shifted uncomfortably, no longer able to dismiss it with a grin. Then came the final blow, a signed email from years ago where he discussed keeping her in the dark to preserve full control. The judge read it aloud, word for word, and then looked at him. "Do you deny writing this?" He tried to speak, but his voice faltered. I don't remember." Silence fell. Her lawyer pressed forward. "This was intentional. Not negligence. Not miscommunication. It was systematic financial abuse." The judge didn't speak immediately. Instead, she marked something in her notes and said, "We will reconvene tomorrow for judgment." That night, the woman didn't sleep, but it wasn't anxiety that kept her awake. It was hope. She spent the night pacing her apartment, not out of fear, but out of reflection. Every detail of the past 5 years rushed through her, each humiliation, each silent dinner, each tear shed in the darkness of the bedroom. Yet something had shifted. She didn't feel powerless anymore. Her daughter slept soundly in the next room, her breathing calm, her presence comforting. The woman took out an old photo album and flipped through pages filled with memories, holidays, birthdays, small smiles caught between harder times. She lingered on one photo where she held her daughter, both laughing over spilled flour during baking. That woman, she realized, had never disappeared. By morning, she dressed carefully, not to impress, but to feel strong. She wore a navy dress with a modest neckline, the same one she wore years ago to a professional conference, back when her voice was respected. She stared at her reflection, not with vanity, but with clarity. "I'm ready," she whispered. She arrived at court early, alone by choice, walking slowly, deliberately. She wasn't afraid anymore. No matter what the verdict held, she had faced the truth and found herself again in the process. Before the judge gave the ruling, she was asked if she had any final statement. She rose slowly, walked to the front, and turned to face the room. Her hands didn't shake. Her voice, though soft, carried. "I stood here weeks ago unable to speak," she began. "I let myself be defined by a version of me crafted by someone who wanted me silent. But today, I stand not as a victim, but as someone who survived that silence and chose to fight it. The gallery was still. Even the court stenographer paused slightly, captivated. She spoke of motherhood, sacrifice, and dignity. Of what it meant to be erased while still being present. Of the wounds invisible to the court, but real nonetheless. He laughed, she said, glancing at her ex, but I knew the truth would echo longer than his laughter. Her lawyer watched, stunned. The judge leaned forward, listening intently. When she finished, there was no applause, just quiet respect. And in that silence, something powerful filled the room. For the first time, the courtroom no longer belonged to him. It belonged to the truth. The courtroom was silent as the judge shuffled the papers before her, her expression unreadable. Everyone seemed to hold their breath. Then, with a sudden firmness, she raised a specific document. "Mr. Reynolds," she said, addressing the ex-husband directly, "is this your signature?" He shifted in his seat, trying to appear composed. "It might be," he said vaguely, but the judge cut him off. "This isn't a game. The court has reason to believe you falsified financial disclosures. That is a federal offense, and this court does not take such matters lightly." Her tone was colder now, stripped of any tolerance. A low ripple spread across the gallery. His attorney leaned in urgently, whispering, while he stared ahead, lips pressed tightly. The woman sat still, her hands folded in her lap, eyes fixed on the judge. "We will pause this proceeding," the judge declared, "and reconvene after a full audit is conducted by the court-appointed financial investigator." Gasps echoed. He was no longer in control of the timeline. The smirk he once wore had vanished. As he tried to speak again, the judge raised her hand and added, "Say nothing more unless advised by counsel. We're past the point of persuasion. This is about accountability now." As the courtroom emptied, the woman stepped outside into the corridor, not expecting the flurry of attention that followed. A local journalist, who had been observing the case, approached with cautious interest. "Would you be open to a comment?" they asked. She simply shook her head. Her strength wasn't for headlines, it was for healing. Behind her, her ex emerged, looking visibly shaken, trying to move quickly past the gathering eyes. One of his business partners, previously seen offering him support during earlier hearings, now crossed to the opposite side of the hallway without greeting him. The collapse of his public mask had begun. Colleagues stopped returning his calls. Emails went unanswered. Business meetings were postponed indefinitely. His world, once defined by manipulation and showmanship, was unraveling in the most visible way. Meanwhile, she returned home, placed her keys on the table, and sat down at the window. She didn't smile, but she breathed easier. For once, justice didn't feel like a fantasy. It felt like momentum. A week later, the court reopened for final testimony. To everyone's surprise, the woman's daughter walked toward the witness stand. Her small frame looked fragile, but her voice did not. "I asked to speak," she said quietly. The judge nodded, granting permission. "I've been listening this whole time," the girl began. "And I know it's not normal for a kid to be in court. But I need you to hear me." Her father looked visibly uncomfortable as she avoided eye contact with him. Instead, she turned to her mother. "She never left me," she said. "I just didn't see it." The room was still. Her voice didn't tremble, but her eyes shimmered. "I believed things that weren't true. I thought my mom didn't care. But I was wrong." She recounted memories, ones that contradicted everything her father had claimed. My mom was there at every recital. She stayed up when I was sick. And when I cried after school, she was the one who held me. Then, finally, she looked at her father. You made me think she abandoned us. But I know now, it was you who walked away. He lowered his gaze. No words followed. Her testimony had spoken for everyone. The fallout came fast. Within days, several of his former business partners filed to dissolve shared ventures. One firm publicly stated they had no prior knowledge of unethical conduct and cut ties immediately. His attorney submitted a motion to withdraw from the case, citing irreconcilable conflict of interest. In every corner of his professional life, doors were closing. And still, the audit reports kept surfacing, each more damning than the last. Offshore accounts, undeclared assets, manipulated loan applications. All carefully documented, now exposed. Meanwhile, she continued working quietly with her legal team. There was no celebration, no gloating. Her victory wasn't about his downfall, it was about restoring her life. She met with her daughter's school counselor, arranged new tutoring sessions, and started preparing their modest new home with care. There was a bookshelf that needed painting, a cracked window she finally repaired. Little by little, the world she once feared losing became her own again, not perfect, but hers. During the final hearing, he was given the chance to address the court. For the first time since the proceedings began, he seemed unsure. His voice was subdued, stripped of charm. I made mistakes, he said slowly. Things got out of hand. He avoided specific language, never said lied, never said manipulated. Instead, he spoke in vague terms, as if passivity might soften the truth. I never meant to hurt anyone, he continued, glancing toward her. Especially not my daughter. The judge remained silent as he spoke, offering no interruption, no reassurance. When he finished, the silence lingered until the judge finally replied, "The court does not require a performance. It requires accountability." Then she turned to the woman. "Do you wish to respond?" She shook her head once, calmly. "No," she said. His words don't change what's already been done. And with that, the court moved to deliver its final decision. The judge cleared her throat and looked over the courtroom with deliberate gravity. After thorough review of the evidence and testimonies provided, she began, "This court finds that the respondent acted in bad faith during the course of these proceedings." She paused, then continued, her tone unyielding. "All concealed assets are to be fully disclosed and equitably distributed. The primary residence shall be awarded to the petitioner. Sole custody of the minor child is granted to the petitioner, with visitation rights limited and supervised." The words echoed with finality. Her ex looked stunned, lips slightly parted as if searching for air. The woman did not cry. She didn't need to. Her strength had outlasted the storm. As the courtroom began to stir, her daughter ran into her arms, holding her tightly. A quiet smile crossed her face, not of triumph, but of release. This wasn't about winning. It was about restoring truth. The judge concluded with a note of stern clarity, "Let this serve as a reminder that manipulation may buy time, but never justice." With that, the gavel fell. The chapter that once brought humiliation now closed with dignity. Within days, local media outlets began reporting on the outcome. Though she had never sought publicity, the story was too compelling to ignore. Court uncovers hidden assets in high-profile divorce, one headline read. Another called it a landmark case for financial transparency in marital law. She received messages from strangers, some offering support, others sharing their own stories of silence and survival. A university legal professor even referenced the case in a seminar on ethics, calling it an example of perseverance against systemic dismissal. She declined interviews, choosing instead to return to the rhythms of daily life. While others discussed her in boardrooms and classrooms, she focused on rebuilding her home. Her daughter helped repaint the living room, laughing when they splashed color on each other. The laughter was real again. For the first time in a long while, peace wasn't something she chased, it was something she could feel in the room, in the small moments, in the way her daughter now reached for her hand without hesitation. Their days settled into quiet routines. She returned to part-time curriculum consulting, helping local schools modernize their learning plans. Her daughter enrolled in a theater program at school, and each afternoon, they talked about rehearsals and scripts over dinner. Weekends were filled with visits to bookstores, walks in the park, and meals they cooked together. They didn't talk about the past often, but when they did, it was without shame. The pain was real, but so was the healing. One evening, her daughter looked up from the dinner table and asked, "Do you think we're stronger now?" She smiled. "Not because of what we went through," she answered, "but because we chose not to let it define us." That night, they played music as they cleaned up, dancing in the kitchen to a playlist from years ago. The weight was lifting, not all at once, but steadily, one note, one laugh, one heartbeat at a time. Weeks later, as she sorted through the mailbox, a small envelope caught her eye. No return address. Inside, a neatly folded note. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the words were unmistakably personal. "Thank you for standing up when others stay silent. You reminded me that quiet strength can still move mountains." There was no signature. Just a small, pressed flower tucked inside. She read the note again, then placed it in a drawer beside her daughter's old journal, where reminders of truth and resilience now lived. That night, she sat by the window with a cup of tea, watching the city lights blink softly. She didn't know who sent the letter, and perhaps she never would. But the sentiment felt like closure from someone unseen, an echo of the quiet impact her courage had made beyond the courtroom. She closed her eyes and let the moment settle. This was no longer about survival. It was about presence. She was here. Whole. Awake. 6 months later, she returned to the courthouse, not as a litigant, but as a guest. It was the final hearing to sign the property transfer. As she stepped into the building, the same halls that once witnessed her silence now echoed differently. Her steps were slower, not hesitant but deliberate. She passed by court officers who nodded respectfully. When she entered the courtroom, he was already there, sitting alone, his suit impeccable, but his posture defeated. He didn't speak. She didn't either. When the clerk asked her to confirm her name and signature, she answered clearly. The documents were signed without issue. As she turned to leave, she glanced at him once. Their eyes met briefly. He looked away first. No words were needed. The woman walked out of the courtroom, not with bitterness, not with triumph, but with peace. And this time, she didn't leave anything behind.